started. Hi, I'm Anna Marquise, Civic Engagement Coordinator, and welcome to the People's Review Live, hosted by us, the Equality State Policy Center. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to improve the lives of all Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. The People's Review Live is designed to help people across Wyoming engage with our government and keep up with important issues and debates. When we work together, we can ensure transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. And that's never been more important than it is right now. I'd like to hand things over to Jen Simon, ESPC's Senior Policy Advisor, to talk a little bit more about our work, give a quick overview of housekeeping, and introduce today's panelist.
Thanks, Anna. And thanks everyone for joining us. We have a good crowd assembling so far. On behalf of our entire ESPC team and all of our coalition members, welcome to everybody in the audience and welcome to all of our panelists. Thanks again for joining us. We're excited to get started, but as I do every month, here's a little bit of a housekeeping recap. Everyone in our audience is automatically muted. You can hear us, you can see us. If you cannot do one or the other, please hit Anna up in the chat. If you have any tech issues, she's gonna help you out. Throughout the evening, we'll be posting some resources in the chat feature for you. We'll follow up with an email with those pieces of information tomorrow, but we'd also love for you to put your questions in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. Any we don't get to, we will try and answer in a follow-up email. And even though I know I said this last month, and I'm pretty sure I said it the month before as well, it turns out it's true this month too. This is probably our most timely People's Review Live to date. We're talking about Wyoming's public education system and specifically how we save Wyoming schools and why we should. And we're really looking to start a conversation tonight. It'll be too long to finish in a single hour, but we want to explore some pretty big questions. What's the value of a free public education? What role does public education play in a thriving society? And what do we need to do here in Wyoming to really protect what is an incredibly unique and really powerful resource that we have? And a couple of reminders too about how you can get involved, and we'll come back to this as well. Tomorrow, Joint Appropriations finishes up 2 weeks of talking about the supplemental budget. Tomorrow, the Revenue Committee finishes up day 2 of their meetings talking about revenue. And the Recalibration Committee meets starting on Monday morning, and some of these folks will talk a little bit more about that. But those are all legislative committee meetings that you can tune into virtually. We'll get those links to you in the chat as well. But it's a way for you to get involved. So we're really excited that these folks, these experts have come to talk to us about how we save our schools. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists and then get into some questions. So we'll start with State Senator Jeff Wasserberger. He was raised on a ranch in northern Niobrara County and has been a Wyoming State Senator since 2015. Prior to that, he was in the State House of Representatives, where he was chairman of the House Education Committee. He's a lifelong educator, having retired from the Campbell County School District after a 34-year career as a teacher, principal, and central office administrator. He's really one of the leading advocates in Wyoming for education and an expert on education and public policy. And basically every major important committee, except possibly one, he serves on. So welcome, Senator, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And then we have Janine Bayteski, who is currently serving her 5th term on the Wyoming, sorry, Janine, you're here in Teton County with me and I messed it up. Teton County School District Board of Education. She serves as the liaison to the Wyoming Legislature for TCSD and is a past president of the Wyoming School Board Association. She's also served as a director to the National School Board Association from the Western region and is a tremendous advocate for education and students in Wyoming. Prior to her life in Wyoming, she spent 25 years as an auto executive for Ford and was in charge of their special vehicle team and the chief engineer for the Ford Mustang. It sounds like we could have a whole People's Review Live talking to Janine about that, which would be fun. Thank you, Janine, for joining us. And then we have Tate Mullen, the Government Relations Director at the Wyoming Education Association. He was raised in Casper before he received a master's degree in poli-sci from UW, where he studied youth voter participation and mobilization. He's worked in Colorado in the Office of Budget and Management, looking at the impacts of taxation policy on county service provision, and was really instrumental in the state of Kansas in helping that state come back from some of the Brownback era tax cuts. So we're thrilled to have Tate here and have him share his expertise. Thanks, Tate, for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk that over you. Brian Farmer is the executive director of the Wyoming School Boards Association, where he's a strong advocate for public education. He used to be an administrator for the Wyoming Department of Corrections, has taught in the Department of Poli-Sci and Criminal Justice at UW, as well as courses in the College of Business and College of Education, and is well recognized as an expert on education policy and law. So welcome, Brian. And again, welcome to all of you. We're thrilled to have your assembled expertise here tonight. So I want to start out with a couple of resources. This is sort of moderator's prerogative, so that everybody who's listening can kind of have a little bit of information to go away with. So I want to, hang on one second, all I have up is a Zoom, so I'm not going to share that just yet. But what I want to share with you is the Wyoming Department of Education has a fantastic site called Wyoming Measures Up. And what that enables you to do is take a look at all sorts of resources in terms of your community. So you can see that you can view a state report for your state, for your specific district, and for your school. So when we click on that state report, you get a great little dashboard of the facts and figures for Wyoming schools. You can see our total enrollment across the state, the number of schools, the graduation rate, which if I'm not mistaken is actually a little bit better from 2018, 2019, it's improved just slightly. But you can also click through and it's got great tabs that'll show you all kinds of things at a glance. You can see on this slide that over a third of all students are qualified as low income, but you can check out your school performance and all sorts of things in this feature. So we wanted to make sure that you had a little resource to get you started. And now we'll turn to questions. So Senator, I'd love to start with you if I may.
Okay.
All right, so in most of the country, the quality of a public education really might depend on your zip code. But in Wyoming, that's not how we fund our schools. Can you talk a little bit about how we fund education in the Equality State and why that's so important and unique?
Well, first of all, let me say unequivocally that that was the way that we funded education prior to the Washkee versus Hirschler and the Campbell 1 cases. So you could actually say that that was very much true in the state of Wyoming, so that a state that had a high assessed valuation could fund education much better than any other state, say, or county, say, like Niobrara County. And the differences were, Campbell County School District had, through recapture, millions and millions of additional dollars compared to, say, Niobrara County School District, which has the lowest assessed valuation in the state. And so that was true prior to the Campbell cases. And so now, actually, what eventually happened was Campbell 1 was declared, the funding model was declared unconstitutional, which was the old classroom unit. And we went to a new funding model eventually, which was called MAP. And then MAP was done away with a second model, which was actually created by Pikus and Auden. And that's when I was chair of the House Education Committee and Hank Coe was chair of the Senate Committee. That funding model was ultimately declared constitutional in the state of Wyoming by the Wyoming Supreme Court. And that was declared constitutional, I think, in 2007. The case was Campbell 4. And so there's a number of neat things that we do in our funding model that are very much different than anywhere else. Number one of the things that I think is really cool is Wyoming is the only state to refund special education at 100%. We're the only state to refund transportation at 100%. Our model is essentially based on average daily membership, or ADM, based on what is called the basket of goods. And so we had to, according to the Campbell cases, find what the basket of goods meant, how much it cost, and then we had to fund it. And they told us it didn't matter. If we didn't have the money, we had to raise taxes to do it. The other thing that is groundbreaking in the United States, and these are landmark cases I'm talking about, is Campbell 2. Campbell 2, and its major piece of being a landmark case was that it also said you can't fund the building of schools based on your zip code. You have to have the entire state fund all schools buildings through the state. And so essentially what happened was the creation of the School Facilities Commission, and that all schools would be built by the state. No longer would we be passing bond issues to build schools and have a difference from, say, Campbell County to what I said, Niobrara County, or let's go Platte County or Carbon County. And so the landmark pieces of the case are essentially the new funding model, which relatively has been unchanged since 2007. There's been a few tweaks in it, but it is the exact same model that we had 13 years ago. And the other piece is the school facilities piece, which actually I have the opportunity to sit on that committee. And so that's how we do it. We find what's in the basket of goods. We decide how we're going to fund that. And then at the end of the day, the school district go through an entire model. There's 39 components to that model. And ultimately they come up with a final figure, which is ultimately their budget. In Campbell County, that's about $140 million. And so that's how we do it. And that was a long answer, and I'm sorry to run on.
No, that was a great answer, Senator. And with all due respect, I might ask Tate if he can also help some of the lay people in the audience understand what some of those components to the budget are, right? Because as a fairly new person to listening to appropriations talk about the budget or getting ready for school recalibration, I'd love to help our audience understand how do they engage with a very complicated budgeting process and a very complicated recalibration process. So thanks for setting that up for us, Senator. And Tate, would you talk a little bit about the next steps of that model and how we might understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very daunting task to try and tackle that model. When I first looked at it, it is essentially what is a very, very complex math problem where you have interactive pieces. And the components that Senator Wasserberger was talking about, those interactive components really kind of lay the groundwork for what that model is. We start with ADM. We start with the number of students that are enrolled. There are other components such as classroom size, the square footage, the number of teachers that you have per classroom based on that ADM. So you have all of these very interactive components within the model. And what has typically happened is, in what we're looking at now in recalibration, is that Pikus and Auden will present a model that works in an entirety. And Pikus and Auden have noted that this model is the most cost-effective way of implementing education across the state of Wyoming, but it only works if you implement the whole thing. But what has happened over the years is that there are pieces that are looked at separately and tweaked. And the issue becomes when those pieces are tweaked, because it's a complex math problem, you're of course going to end up with a different answer. It's a very complex model. But the idea that it is interactive and that those components do impact one another is probably the biggest takeaway that I would have. I don't know if Janine or Brian would like to add to that.
Sure, I would. So the interesting thing about it is, at the end of the day, you have these components that get funded as a result of ADM, by the way, stands for average daily membership, which is the attendance of your students. So you have all of these components. Well, I will suggest to you that out of the 48 school districts, we're all different. Our communities and our school districts demand different things from us. consequently, it's referred to as a block grant. So whereas one school district may spend more money on one component of the model, another district may spend more on another component of the model. The good news, bad news about the model is it's very transparent. The record keeping of each of the line items within the model is very closely scrutinized and is reviewed by the legislature every year. And there are some folks that really have a difficult time in understanding that we're all different and we all need to spend our money different in order to be able to meet the needs of the students in our district. So we continue to work on that challenge to make sure that everybody understands that we need to, my community, for example, we offer a few career tech classes, but it's not nearly as strong as, say, maybe what happens down in Carbon County. So, you know, how do you fund the model so that we can use the funds appropriately so that we can offer the basket that our community needs?
You know, I would add to that it's important to understand that one of the key underpinning pieces of the Wyoming model is that it's a cost-based model. So in other words, when the legislature defines the education that it expects for the state, then it becomes the state's obligation to cost that out. Senator Wasserberger said that's one of the jobs of the legislature, is to identify what is the education we want for Wyoming, what do we expect, and then we have to figure out what does that cost. And so really, that's a big piece of what the consultants hired by the legislature do. They go out and they figure out what does it cost to provide this basket of goods, and then you have to fund that. And so each of those model components, what does it cost to have elementary teachers? What does it cost to have elective teachers? What does it cost to have maintenance and operations within a district? What does it cost to have a regional cost adjustment? Because cost across our state is different. Those of you that live in Teton County know that it's a little more expensive than some other places. So it's very key to understand that Wyoming's system is intended to be cost-based. And so when we talk about, you know, can we make it less expensive, or what makes it so expensive? The real key lies right there, looking at what are the cost drivers in the model itself.
Well, and I so appreciate how everybody has fleshed this out and helped me and hopefully our listeners understand. I'm curious too, will you talk a little bit about, and I'll start with you again, Senator, how we fund education right now and what's at stake in terms of our budget. Now, we've all heard that there's significant structural deficit in our budget. Anyone listening to appropriations today heard some pretty heated conversation right around lunchtime about cuts and the possibility of taxes. And I'd love to help people understand, how are we paying for it now? And what's at stake in terms of potential cuts? Senator, it's not, you know,
Well,
a hard
thank you.
question.
But you know what, first, before we start, I just wanted to, there's one thing that everybody did very well. Tate and Brian and Janine kind of cleaned up the things that I forgot. But the one thing that we haven't mentioned that needs to be stated is that when you have a block grant, that goes to the districts and they're allowed to spend it any way that they choose. However, when we did a study a few years ago on how that money was spent, we found that 98.5% of the total money spent was spent exactly as the funding model said. And so when you talk about block grant, that it goes back to the district and they can do whatever they want, everybody agrees that this is the formula is the best way to educate kids. Now let's talk about how we fund education. We fund education through property taxes, which, as you know, is not necessarily it's the most regressive tax that we have. And essentially what happens is people who own property have something that's called a mill levy. And a mill is actually 0.00001 of a dollar. And so the state of Wyoming, if you levied 1 mill statewide right now, because we've had a drop in the assessed valuation of the state, it levies about $15 million. And so it used to be 20 million. So you can see the difference there just a few short years ago. But right now, I think, I can't remember exactly, and maybe Brian remembers, but I think for education, we levy, is it 35 mills statewide? And essentially all of those mills go into the foundation guarantee. And for many years, we were having surpluses in the funds, and that's exactly how we created the Hathaway plan. But right now, currently, they are projecting, because of a drop of the enrollment in our state, or the assessed valuation in our state, we're anticipating, I believe the last number I saw was a $359 million shortfall. And what the problem with that is that grows to 600 million in 4 years' time. And so right now, we also have the issue of how we fund schools through the school facilities. And of course, that fund is not doing as well either. And so I guess that's kind of a fast-paced view of how we fund education. That's not to say that we couldn't change and maybe have a 1 cent sales tax, and that's used to fund education. There's other options out there. You could raise mill levies. The problem with mill levy is, at least for me, being from an energy-rich county, it really falls hard on the mineral industry. And the mineral industry has always paid our taxes in this state. And the problem with that is that if people haven't been accountable for what they've received. As I think for many years, there used to be the old story that for me as a citizen in the state of Wyoming, I pay $3,000 worth of taxes every year. And I receive $30,000 every year in services. So my roads are in pretty good shape. My schools are in great shape. Incidentally, the National Assessment of Educational Progress ranks Wyoming's school system 5th in the United States. And I say that that's low. I think we're much higher than that. I think we're number 1. And the reason why I say we're number 1 is because I believe that there's not a state out there that wouldn't trade us straight across for our educational system that we have right now because of Campbell 2, which said we had to build the schools. I believe our schools are better than any other school in the United States. And I think our system's just right up there in the top 5. So with that, I'll let others speak.
I love that answer, Senator. It's fantastic. And actually, I might have you say that exact thing again to take us out at the end of the hour so that everybody leaves on a high note.
Well, and as Janine knows, and as educators know, the National Assessment of Educational Progress is the Associated Press ranking of schools. I mean, it's like Alabama's number 1. I think Wyoming is number 1.
I love it. Well, and I think that's a great segue into what's a really important component of this conversation. And Janine, I'll turn to you on this. Why does it matter? Why is education so important, first off, but what role do our schools play in our communities and the future of the state?
Thank you for that question, Jen, because it's really, really an important question. First of all, as Senator Wasserberger said, our taxes are based on assessments, right? Part of the reason we're in such trouble now is because a lot of that assessment value is based on oil and gas.
Right.
The oil and gas industry is not what it used to be. So saying that, I think the only way that Wyoming is really going to save itself is to diversify its economy. We have got to learn how to attract other businesses to the state and find a means for those businesses to contribute to the tax base of the state. And oh, by the way, those businesses are going to need the human capital that our K-12 system puts out. So we have got to be able to train our folks to be able to generate the workforce that's needed to move forward. So just a number for you. So if Wyoming high schools reached a graduation rate of 90%, okay, that would mean these graduates, we would have gained 730 additional graduates, which would have earned $9.8 million, which contributes $75,000 into state taxes. So, I mean, you kind of get the picture is that in addition to providing that human capital that the diversification of our economy is going to need.
I'd
Well,
like to add
thank
to
you.
that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to turn to you, Tate. So you go.
Yeah, no, sorry for jumping in, but you know, Senator Wasserberger got me all fired up, and then Janine just took it away. So, no, absolutely. You know, one of the other issues that we're looking at here, and I think that becomes very problematic, is that, you know, there's all this energy that is focused on the cost of education. And I think Senator Wasserberger was spot on, is that we do very well in this state. Like, our education system is amazing. Our educators are amazing. They do a great job. And during this whole pandemic, I can't sing their praises enough. They are amazing, and they have just really stepped up. That being said, you know, Janine is spot on in that, you know, they are that fertile ground that provides us the entrepreneurs of tomorrow. They are the fertile ground that provides the business leaders, the community leaders, those future Senator Wasserbergers, right? They are the folks that really can pull us out of the track that we have been in, you know. And there's a lot of emphasis on, well, we can't raise taxes because businesses are going to leave the state, or they are adverse to taxes. The other issue, though, becomes is that they don't just look at a state's tax structure, right? They look at what other components a state offers: access to healthcare. What does your education system look like? Are your graduates, like Janine said, are they ready to roll into a workforce? One of our biggest problems is that not that we spend that much money on education, but that investment goes elsewhere. We have a substantial problem with the youth of this state leaving the state of Wyoming because there aren't the job opportunities here. And we do need to diversify the economy, but one of the things that we need to take care of before we can diversify the economy is our tax structure. Because any additional economic input or positions actually puts a strain on our system and is detrimental. So we need to first address that tax structure and then really move into the diversification piece. But education is fundamental at every step of this.
Absolutely. And thank you, Tate. And Brian, I'd love for you to weigh in as well on the same subject. I think you unmuted at one point so that you could. So.
Yeah, well, you know, Jen, I was going to tell you that it's important to know that school finance is complex. It's good to talk about kind of a general sense and how can the average person understand it, but it is complex. And I will point to a couple of different resources in case any of the listeners are interested. First of all is the Wyoming Legislature's website. Fantastic resources that the Legislative Service Office has created. Under their state finance section, there is a school finance tab, and you can look at a block grant flow chart. And that's a wonderful, wonderful resource at explaining how the funding model works. Also, in their general in their general state finance section, there's something called the Budget Data Fiscal Book. And that book tells you, for example, where does each ad valorem property tax go to? Where does a federal mineral royalty go to? Where does a coal lease bonus go to? So every revenue that comes in the state, that says where does it go? Now, anybody who's really super bored, there's a book called School Finance in the 50 States and Indian Country by Information Age Publishing. And I wrote a book chapter on school finance in Wyoming. And so anybody who's looking to get put to sleep, I don't get royalties on that. But you want to read about it, there's a very comprehensive discussion of school finance in Wyoming. But you did ask, and I just wanted to get back to a question that you asked is about the importance of education. And I want to just real quick share some words from territorial governor, our first territorial governor, Governor Campbell, in his address to the first Legislative Assembly of Wyoming Territory on October 13th, 1869, said this: "In laying the foundation of a new state, education should be the cornerstone, for without it, no durable political fabric can be erected. It matters little how great our material prosperity may be if our moral and intellectual growth does not keep pace with it. It is a duty we owe not only to ourselves and our posterity, but to all mankind. In the diffusion of knowledge among the people rests our only hope for the preservation of free institutions. Now in the infancy of our territory, let the fostering aid and encouragement of the government be given to every scheme for the advancement of education and to establish as the cornerstone of our embryo state the principle of universal free common school education." And Campbell wasn't the only one. Governor Hoyt, I want to say Governor Moonbeam, but that's going to California. But we've had a number of our territorial and then early governors that talk about education as being key to Wyoming. So this is no mistake. This is no recent invention. This is not something that just came up in a couple of court cases out of the 1990s. This is something that has been at the center of Wyoming from the very beginning, that education is what we build our state upon. And so to make it a constitutional right of our students and to make it something that is at the center of what our state is about is really why education is important, because it's that right of students. It's something that it's a promise that Wyoming has made to our students. And so today we talk about how does Wyoming live up to her promises. And I think that that's really the discussion that we're having. And it's a tough one. And I think school finance is important, and it's the how, but the why has to be where we start. And I think those words from some of our early governors really help us to remember that from the beginning, we've had a focus that is the cornerstone, the very thing we built our state upon.
Thank you, Brian. I mean, that's just an extraordinary quote, as people have noted in the chat already. But I think framing it that way, how does Wyoming live up to her promise, is really something that I'd like to get into with all of you right now, too, because we are in a situation where we are trying to balance that really central core value and promise of the state with some very real financial challenges. I think you all have already started to talk about it. But how do we maintain our commitment and also balance cuts and possible revenue options as we go forward? Senator, you're unmuted, so I think I'm going to put you on the spot.
Well, could you restate that question for me?
Absolutely. I was long-winded. I apologize. I'm curious how we maintain our commitment to education in view of the fiscal picture. How do we balance that commitment, that promise, with the structural deficit that we have? And maybe a better way to put it is to say, how do we continue to keep the values-based conversation that you all are having, and the why of this at the forefront as we go forward and compel more people to get engaged with the tax question that's come up?
Well, Jen, that's a really tough question, and it's a great question. And I don't know where to start what I will say is, I think it's going to be very important what happens on Monday and Tuesday of next week at the recalibration committee. And I'm assuming that they will make little tweaks in the model. So for instance, they will look at class sizes and they will raise those class sizes. And then essentially, and they may look at regional cost adjustment, because regional cost adjustment can save some money. And they may look at, say, instead of 100% reimbursement for special education costs, we will only do 95%. And literally, we spend about $300 million a year on special education costs. And so that saves you 15 million. And so I see like a lot of little changes within the model to try and come up with that 200 million, or maybe it even gets more severe than that. They go even further. But the other part of that is we still have $1.7 billion in the legislative reserve, strategic reserve account, which is normally called LISRA. Lots of times we call it the rainy day fund. And so I'm not real sure that we can't access that, not to the tune of 359 million, but maybe 100 million or so. I have spent this last couple of weeks, I've had several phone calls from superintendents talking about what these projected cuts could cost their school district. And I'm very concerned because, quite frankly, if you look at a 20% cut, a school district's total budget, 85 to 88% of their total budget is in salaries for people, for employees. And so the only way you have very little leeway, you have 15% of your budget left that is on top of what school districts can spend. So really, in reality, the only way that you can handle as a school district a 10 or 20% cut is to cut people. And ultimately what that means is, quite frankly, class sizes would have to go up. Do you cut all your classified folks? I mean, essentially, I don't know if the people of Wyoming realize what that's going to do. And the thing that everybody needs to remember is the importance of education, but not also to the human investment in people, but to each individual economy of the 48 school districts out there. So for instance, if you had to cut in Gillette, we have about 700 teachers in our district. So if you cut 10%, is that 70 people? Our classifieds are about the same number because we have so many bus drivers. It's for the local economy. You need to remember that a school district is typically in every community across the state, the top 3 employers within that community. And most of the time it's number 1. And so this is a huge issue to every town. And I'm not real sure that the people really know what the stakes are, because they're so used to their school districts being so well funded, they don't understand what it's going to do at the end of the day. And so how do we energize people? Well, one of the things that's going to happen is the talk is that we would have a May session. Well, the problem with having a May session is that school districts have to have their contracts out for initial contract teachers. I think it's the 1st of April. And for continuing contract teachers, it's April 15th. Anyway, by April 15th, they have to be able to tell every teacher out there what their salary is and what they're getting paid. And so waiting till May is really going to cause some real problems. And I've heard that from 4 different superintendents over the last couple of weeks. And they've called me and said, Jeff, this is a real issue. And I don't know how to solve that. Years ago, our salaries had dropped to 44th in the United States. And so there was a huge push statewide. And there were 3 different teacher salary increases in the model. And I carried all 3 of those bills, and they all 3 passed. And there was huge public outcry across our state for those salaries, all 3 of them. But now no one's saying a word. And so it really bothers me. And I have always thought this about education since we took over funding all schools. You used to have to pass a bond issue to get public support to build a new school. Well, we don't have to do that anymore. And so those pro-education people out there have been largely silent because everything has been so good and the system has been good. And so how do we get people involved? Actually, Jen, through things that we're doing right now. We've got 41 participants on here listening, and the only way we can do it literally is to have them speak to their legislator, have them email their legislator. But there are other issues within the budget itself. You know, the general fund, we're seeing cuts there, and there's been some incredible programs that have been cut, like the National Guard Cowboy Challenge. I mean, Guernsey, Wyoming, there's 50 employees in that program, and Guernsey, Wyoming's a town of 1,000 people. If you take 50 people out of that town, it's going to hurt. So yeah, I'll get off the soapbox.
No, I really appreciate it. And I have another question, but Janine, I see you've unmuted. I want you to jump in.
Well, first of all, you have to be really clear here. We cannot cut our way out of this. And if we want to really take the kind of reductions that are being talked about, you're going to have to redefine what we refer to as the basket of goods, because it can't be delivered at the same level for less money. So, you know, that's just just the way it is. And I'm sure Brian has a lot more to say about that than I just stated. But you know, it's an interesting puzzle to me. And as Senator Wasserberger says, you know, we can, if you look at where we're number one, we are number one in the country for the cost of health care. We are number one in the country for the cost of fixing our roads. You know, there's a bunch of things that we're number one in the country for the cost of. And, you know, my soapbox is when you look at the huge escalation in the cost of education over the last 10 years, you will find that it tracks directly to the increase in the cost of healthcare over the cost of the last 10 years. And so, I mean, I don't know what to say. Like I said, you can't cut your way out of it. And I'm not sure that we're working on the right problem to solve. The problem we ought to be trying to solve is, how do we get affordable healthcare for the people in the state of Wyoming, including our educators, which would bring down the cost of education.
Well, and I so appreciate the fact that you're all pointing out, but that particular comment points out just how interrelated everything is, right? This is not just about education. This is not just about taxes or cuts. It's also about healthcare. And it really is about, how do we have a big vision for the future of the state? We obviously already have a constitution that takes a really thoughtful and visionary and kind of radical approach to making sure that everybody's educated for a very good reason. So Tate, how would you respond to the—
one more
go ahead,
comment
Janine.
before you move on? The good senator mentioned, you know, about how dire things are in the state. Well, you have to think about one other thing that you just brought up is, school is the village. Right. And as the state continues to cut everywhere else, those services don't go away. Our kids still need mental health services. Our kids still need some of those other support services. So they come to the schools to get them. So the job just gets tougher.
And that's so important to point out, and it goes to the question I was gonna tee up for you, Tate, which is, you know, we have a question in the chat. We've heard it before. Maybe our offerings are too luxurious. Maybe we have too many school districts. How do you respond to those kind of sort of questions and maybe critiques in terms of what things look like right now, and that we could essentially do more with less.
That's a can of worms, isn't it?
Sorry.
There's a little bit there to unpack. So let's first look at the idea that we're champagne taste on a beer budget, right? The idea, though, is that we have an economies of scale issue in the state of Wyoming. But what we first need to recognize is that at every level, government service of public services is always going to cost more than the private sector. There are equity issues that make it a necessity that we provide public education, right? So public education is there to ensure that everybody has that equity and access, and in terms of those standards across the board. So with the recognition that it's already going to cost more, and then in the state of Wyoming having a economies of scale issue, and for those that, I'll break that down a little bit more simply, because of the rural nature of our state, the cost of that service provision is much more than it is in our surrounding states that have larger cities to kind of share some of that cost and distribute it out. So it does become more expensive. And when you have states surrounding us, who, if we look at teacher salaries, you know, one of the complaints has been how much teachers are paid. Well, it takes that level of salaries within the state to attract those teachers here. And getting to what Senator Wasserberger had mentioned earlier and how that functions within the block grant, right? You know, I mean, even though that we're at that 98.5% spent within the model, the fact of the matter is that districts do use some of that money to reallocate towards teacher salaries because they recognize that, look, I'm not going to be able to draw somebody into this rural community to provide an education because there are certain aspects of living in that rural community that are very difficult for them. You know, access to healthcare, the things that we take for granted in terms of like shopping access or entertainment, those types of things. So it just naturally is going to cost more, but it is an upfront investment. And this is a piece that I think is huge. And one of the reasons that I am a huge advocate for early childhood education. What we recognize is that there is this upfront investment that pays huge dividends in the end, that return on investment lowers the cost in the end. And the same can be said of education in general, right? That investment is an investment in the state, in the economy of the state, and making sure that we have students who are successful in their education careers are less likely to have negative law enforcement contacts. They are less likely to utilize public services such as TANF or food stamps, that they earn more, right? And it's just very beneficial all around. So when we have these discussions of, well, what is enough? You know, what should our education system look like? Is this luxurious? We do really well in the state of Wyoming with education, and that is due in large part to the type of educators that we have here. But that does in no way mean that they aren't struggling, that they don't have access to some of the essentials that they need, or that, like here in Laramie County, that we have capacity issues in terms of buildings, right? This isn't the Casbah. But we do really well because as Wyomingites, we are resilient, right? And we make do with what we have got, and we have figured out a way to make that work. So that was very long-winded, but there was just a lot to unpack there. But our education system, we need to continue that investment, especially if we want to move forward.
Jen, if I could, I'd like to address what I think are some maybe mythologies and certainly some misunderstandings. I think you hear people say things like Wyoming teachers are some of the best paid in the country. The truth of the matter is Wyoming teachers rank somewhere around 16, 17, 18, somewhere in that range in the nation. So we are not a top 10 paying state for teacher salaries in the nation. Some people say, well, Wyoming has too many administrators. Administrators make up less than 4% of the budget. That's every administrator in the system. Some people say we have too much activities. Same thing with activities. No district spends more than 4% of its budget on activities. Well, if we just bought and paid for things on economies of scale and we got better purchasing and whatnot, supplies and equipment, 3% of a budget. If you say, well, gosh, what if we consolidate districts and we got rid of some of those kinds of things? That would, according to the Legislative Service Office, save about $8.5 million, less than 1%, 0.7% approximately of what's spent. So there's many ideas out there of what we cut. But if we say state cut 10%, and you say, okay, so let's cut all activities. There's no activities at all now in high schools or in any schools. All administrators, no principals, no superintendents, nothing. We're still not to 10%. Add in that school district consolidation, we're still not to 10%. So let's get into some better purchasing practices across the state, and let's just cut purchasing in half by about 50%. Well, now we've maybe got to that 10%. So the reality is that's not realistic. So how does it happen? It's people. People within the system, as Senator Wasserberger said, and realistically to say, let's do this in a way that does not hurt the classrooms is unrealistic. It is going to impact classrooms. It's to what degree do we want that to impact a classroom? And that's really that basket of goods discussion. How much do we impact classrooms by making different decisions around a basket of goods? And so you can ask lots of those kinds of questions, and those are good ideas and things that ought to be looked at, but the real dollars and cents come down to personnel, and the largest personnel group is teachers. Just a very rough estimate. If we were again to talk about a 10% cut statewide, I think you'd be talking about more than 1,500 jobs. That's a ballpark of what a 10% cut might look like statewide. And that's a conservative estimate. I think you might be looking beyond that. So that gives a picture of some of the realities to some of the everyday suggestions that I think we hear in the discussions. Now, can we make cuts? Certainly, we can make cuts. Should we make cuts? Well, that's a policy decision. That's a discussion. In the Campbell cases, there is language that the court uses that says our education system must be the best it can be. Now, you can debate what the court meant by that or whether or not that's an important part of the court ruling or not, but the court did say that. And so that's largely what has driven Wyoming. And you say, okay, so, well, what about comparing Wyoming to other states? What about looking at states with small populations like ours? What about our surrounding and neighboring states? Well, in 2018, the legislature commissioned a study by Augenblick, Palich, and Associates, and they did look at that. And the state with the closest population to ours, Vermont, actually spends more than Wyoming spends on education. And some people could say, oh, well, they're New England. Yes, they're New England, but they're also not as remote and spread out as Wyoming. And so there are costs of distribution. There are costs to remoteness. And so you look at a state that has great remoteness, and you look at Alaska and you say, oh, well, Alaska actually spends kind of close to Wyoming when you look at costs for things like that. Now, of course, it's more spread out than Wyoming. You could probably fit 2 to 3 Wyomings in Alaska. So it's not the same. But the reality is we're not Vermont. We're not Alaska. We're Wyoming. And the reality is the experience that Wyoming school districts have year in and year out. And I would say that my kudos go to people like Janine, those locally elected school board members who are public officials. Janine's elected by her community to make a decision to be a steward of state dollars. And I can tell you from having worked with Janine that she takes that job very, very seriously. That most of our school board members across Wyoming are rather conservative in their approach to that spending of a public dollar. How do they do it in a fiscally responsible way that honors the state in the direction the state has given? So what do we change? Well, I think it comes back to what Janine said. If we want to change the cost of education, we have to look at what the state has said it expects in education, and that's that basket of goods.
Well, thank you, Brian. And I'm rendered speechless by the four of you for your expertise and your passion and what you're willing to share with us. I actually would like to just sort of round up the usual suspects and get the band back together in January and talk about it some more, because we've barely scratched the surface and now we're effectively out of time. So I just want to say thank you again to all of you for starting to educate all of us about how the whole system works, what's really at stake, and how we can carry the legacy forward. That the promise of Wyoming is about educating ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, and making sure that we stay committed to that core promise and that core value. So we will be following up with all of you. We will be following up with everybody who participated with some resources and opportunities. And if anybody has a quick parting shot for the good of the order before I kick it over to Anna and she takes us home, jump in now, Janine.
So I will say that one of the things that educators do not do a very good job of is talking about all the great things that they do and all the great things that they do for kids. So they're a very humble bunch, and that's too bad, because I think if we were a little bit more out there, maybe people would understand it a little better. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that becomes one of the things that we can all do, is help lift up the educators in our communities and make sure that people see that and hear that and feel that, because there is a lot at stake right now. So again, well, I would love to have you all back and continue this conversation, because we are just really scratching the surface of it right now. But I'm going to say thank you all very much and hand it over to Anna to take us home.
Thanks for joining the People's Review Live. The Equality State Policy Center is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We rely on charitable gifts to fund all of our work. Donations can be made on the web at equalitystate.org or by mailing a check to 419 South 5th Street, Laramie, Wyoming 82070. If you'd like to help sponsor the series, let us know. If you'd like to sign up for the newsletter, action alerts, or make a donation, use the web address in the chat. And don't forget to tune into the School Finance Recalibration Committee meeting on Monday at 1 o'clock. You can find the link at wyoleg.gov. Thanks so much for joining us, and see you at the next People's Review Live, where we'll be tackling more great topics.
Thanks for having us.